Our countdown to the top 25 teams in college football continues Wednesday. The top 131 teams, up and ranked over on CBSSports.com. We did 25 through 21 on Tuesday, so today we dip inside the top 25 teams, sponged into the top 10, and then we get into the deep dives on the top 10. Today, though, all about Michigan State, Miami, Penn State, Cincinnati, and Arkansas. Michigan State surprised a few last year with their 11-2 record and their 9th ranking. There were a few good Sparty parties. Miami starting anew with Mario Cristobal, James Franklin. A little bit of a hot seat there at Penn State. Cincinnati have some holes to fill, and will 2022 continue the return of Arkansas to prominence in college football? All right, for more on numbers 20 through 16, let's bring in CBS Sports college football writer Tom Fornelli. Tom, let's start with Michigan State at number 20. Mel Tucker says, hey, you know what? We got everything that we could out of this roster last season, surprised everyone with an 11-2 campaign and a bowl victory. So when you look at 2022, what are you expecting from them this season?
You know, it's hard to know exactly what to expect from Michigan State this year because they are one of the more fascinating cases in that they're one of the biggest benefactors of the transfer portal era to this point so far, in that Mel Tucker came and took over the job just before the 2020 season. But last year, he hit the portal very hard, got a couple of important transfers, primarily Kenneth Walker at running back, who went on to have one of the best seasons in the country and completely revamped that offense and helped spark them to the run that they had to get them to the Peach Bowl. But a lot of those players are gone, and now Mel Tucker has been back in the transfer portal this offseason trying to see if he can hit a home run again, and we haven't seen a program be able to do that kind of sustained success with transfers to this point because we're still somewhat early in this transfer portal era. So it's going to be very interesting to see what the Spartans can do. But if you just look at this team and what they have coming back, the one thing to me besides the transfers is what are we going to see from this team defensively? Because last year the offense was great. I already mentioned Kenneth Walker, but if you look at how they performed defensively, there was a lot of bend but don't break to this team that I'm not sure they can sustain. You can see with those numbers there with the defensive success rate, EPA, pass EPA, they weren't good. But, you know, Mel Tucker said they were dead-ass last in passing last year. They weren't that bad, but they still weren't good. But you see when they get to the red zone, they were able to stop teams from scoring touchdowns, which kept them in games. Will they be able to sustain that in 2022 to the same levels? I have some skepticism, and then especially when you look at their schedule, there is a murderous stretch of their schedule starting in late September where they're going on the road to Washington, then they're hitting Minnesota, at Maryland, Ohio State, Wisconsin, at Michigan, and you look at last year's schedule. Last year they got Northwestern, Nebraska, and Purdue from the West. This year they get Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Illinois. Those are two tougher games than any of the ones they had to play last year. So it's going to be interesting to see what kind of rebound or regression we might see from the Spartans this year.
All right, so they are sitting at number 20. At number 19, the University of Miami. And for the third time in 6 years, they have a new coach, and it is, once again, the dawn of a new era in Coral Gables. Tom, the future looks bright, but what about the present?
You know, it's an annual rite of the college football offseason. Miami does something, and you spend all offseason convincing yourself that this is the year Miami's going to be good again. And then the season starts, and reality hits, and like you said, you've got 3 head coaches in 6 years. And I've done my best not to get too hyped up about the Hurricanes in 2022 with Mario Cristobal coming in. But Jeremy, I'm kind of excited about Miami going into 2022. I think you start at the quarterback position. You know, my Cover 3 co-host Danny Cannell is always referring to the ACC as the conference of quarterbacks. I think Tyler Van Dyke, Miami's quarterback, is the best quarterback in this conference, and I think he was spectacular last year leading this offense. And you look at this team, he's back. You got a lot of production coming back. There's some questions about who you have at wide receiver, who's going to step forward. For me, I think a bigger thing that Miami can do offensively is to find more explosiveness in the run game. They ranked 92nd nationally there last year, but on defense, a lot of the returning production is coming back. I think that's going to be a strong unit. I think Mario Cristobal is going to want to bring more of a physical element that we've seen that Miami might have been missing the last few years. And if you look at their schedule, they've got A&M on the road and Clemson on the road. Those are probably the only 2 games on the entire schedule in which they are going to be underdogs. They should be favored in the other 10 games. So while I don't think Miami is a team that you could realistically say is going to come in and win the ACC and compete for a playoff berth, I do think they can win the ACC, and I do think they can approach 10 wins and be one of the better teams in the conference. So there is a lot of offseason hype, and you kind of have to hope for the best because we've seen it all collapse before. But I genuinely think Miami's going to be good in 2022.
Tom, I want to follow up with you about Tyler Van Dyke. He really tightened up his game in the back end of last season, going 5-1. You saw the touchdown to interceptions really come down, 20-3. As you look at the Heisman race, where do you see him factoring into that?
Oh, I think if he plays well and Miami plays well and is competing for an ACC title, he's going to have a shot to win the Heisman because it's an award that already loves quarterbacks as it is. And when you put the kind of brand behind Miami and just his profile in that he's not, you see a lot of quarterbacks these days, Jeremy, that are kind of dink and dunkers, throwing the short RPOs and the receivers are doing most of the work. What Tyler Van Dyke does better than a lot of guys is push the ball vertically down the field. He's got an NFL arm and he's got good accuracy down the field that leads to a lot of big plays. So as long as Mario Cristobal doesn't do what he did to Justin Herbert at Oregon and kind of keep him too reined in, if he lets him go a little bit, I think Van Dyke could put up some video game type numbers and be a Heisman contender this year. Yes.
Sitting at 35-1 in the preseason to win the Heisman. Of course, you know there's changes in Miami. They got rid of the turnover chain, so it is the start of a new era.
It's a sad day.
Yeah, a sad day, yes. At Penn State, a lot of pressure on James Franklin. They're at number 18. The Nittany Lions have gone 11-11 over the past 2 seasons. They head into 2022 having dropped 6 of their last 8 games dating back to last year. Tom, this is a team that will need youth to contribute, won't it?
Yeah, I've been getting yelled at by Michigan State fans all week about these rankings, considering we have the Spartans ranked behind Penn State, which is a team that really hasn't been good at all the last 2 years. But I stand by where we have them because you said there is a youth movement, but they also have a very veteran quarterback coming back into Sean Clifford, who I think is one of the more disrespected players in the nation. And I think something that will be huge for Penn State this year, particularly on offense, is that I think they're going to finally have a running game because that has been the one thing that they have severely lacked the last few years as we've seen them struggle. They have not been able to run the ball. They're ranked in the bottom 126th in rushing EPA last season, 127th per rush, explosive rush rate 120th, and success rate 100th. These are all very bad numbers. You want to be much better than that if you're Penn State and you want to consider yourself a contender in the Big Ten East and for the Big Ten Conference title. But this year they have a 5-star running back in Nicholas Singleton, who there's been a lot of attention to play to 5-star quarterback Drew Allar and the competition for the starting gig there. I think Singleton is a much bigger factor for the Nittany Lions this year in that he's probably the best running back they've had since Saquon Barkley and Miles Sanders were in that backfield. And I'm not saying he's as good as Saquon Barkley, but he is very talented, and he is the kind of game-breaking talent that they have just lacked at that position. And I think that takes a lot of the load off of Sean Clifford, who's kind of had to carry the offense on his own the last few years. Defensively, they lose a couple key players to the NFL, but they still have a solid secondary, what might be the best secondary in the Big Ten. And they've shown an ability to generate a pass rush through different formations and different players. So I think that's still going to be solid. I don't think Penn State's going to win the Big Ten East. I don't think they're as good as Michigan. I don't think they're nearly as good as Ohio State. But I do think we're going to see the Nittany Lions get back to being the team we've expected them to be in recent years rather than the teams we saw last year and in 2020.
Tom, if they don't, or if they start slowly, I mean, how much pressure is there on James Franklin?
I don't think there's too much pressure. He did get a contract extension in the offseason. You know, he used that USC and LSU job openings to his advantage. So congratulations to you on that one, James. I think he's got some security in that contract extension. But I think as far as the fan base is concerned, it might start getting ugly if Penn State has another season like the last couple of years.
All right, let's go to number 17, Cincinnati. The Bearcats have to replace several key players off that 13-1 team that went to the playoff last year. But head coach Luke Fickell, I mean, he knows how to develop talent. He knows how to recruit. What are we expecting from Cincinnati?
I think that last year was the dream season for the Bearcats getting to the college football playoff, and I think that's probably the best case scenario you could ever really hope for as a Bearcats fan until they join the Big 12 and maybe they get more access to the expanded playoff in the future. But you mentioned this is a team that loses a lot, and Luke Fickell has done a fantastic job of recruiting and developing at Cincinnati. But we're not in the same situation where it is with other playoff teams where Alabama can lose 9 or 10 guys to the NFL and they just replace them with 5 stars. Cincinnati recruits well, but it's still a development program. And you mentioned the players that they lost. They had 9 players drafted in the NFL draft last year. Cincinnati, a team from the American Athletic Conference, had 9 players go. And if you look at what that means, like Desmond Ridder is obviously the big name there at the quarterback. Ahmad Gardner, I think, went 4th overall, the top corner in the country. But just production-wise, that's nearly their entire passing offense. They lost nearly their entire rushing offense. They lost their top receiver. And on defense, they lost about 75% of their tackles, 80% of their sacks, the whole bunch of interceptions. It's just hard to imagine Cincinnati being able to replace all of that in one offseason. And while they're still going to be one of the better teams in the American, and I think they could still win the American, you look around the conference, Houston has improved. SMU is improved. I think UCF in its second year with Gus Malzahn is going to be better. So I think Cincinnati's still going to be one of the top group of 5 teams in the country. I think it could still get that New Year's 6 berth. But as far as playoff contention, I think that was just last year only. We're not going to see a repeat of that this year.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Tom, I mean, it's hard to replace a lot of those numbers in terms of the players that have gone to the NFL. All right, let's finish off with Arkansas at number 16. After some time in the wilderness, Sam Pittman has the Razorbacks coming back to prominence. Spent some time in the top 10, beat a Big Ten team for the first time in a bowl game last year. I mean, there's a lot to be excited about here, Tom.
Oh, if you're an Arkansas fan, you're absolutely in love with Sam Pittman, and you should be, because he has revitalized a program that had just kind of been in a dead zone there for a few years. But the other side of that coin is if you're Arkansas, you're playing a really difficult schedule because you're in the SEC West, so you've already got to play the Alabamas, the A&Ms, LSUs, everybody. But then you add a little bit more to it because we just talked about Cincinnati. Well, guess who Arkansas is starting the season against? Cincinnati. Later in the year, they've got a road trip to BYU. So it's a very difficult schedule that the Razorbacks are going to have to make their way through. And they're also going to have to do all this while losing what was probably the most productive player on their offense last season in wide receiver Treylon Burks, who's now in the NFL. If you look at what the Razorbacks did in the passing attack last year, KJ Jefferson had a very good season. He threw for over 2,600 yards and had 21 touchdowns. But most of those throws were to Treylon Burks. He finished with 1,100 passing yards, 607 of which, by the way, came after the catch. So about 25% of KJ Jefferson's passing yards last year were after he threw the ball and Treylon Burks ran. He caught 11 of the touchdowns. Nobody else in Arkansas caught more than 24 passes for 337 yards or 2 touchdowns last year. So that's a ton of production you have to replace. The good news is I think Kendall Briles, the offensive coordinator, wherever he's gone, his offenses have scored points. So I still think that they're going to be able to do that. On the defensive side of the ball, kind of like Michigan State earlier, this is a team that plays a lot of bend but don't break. They don't mind giving up yardage, but once they get into the red zone, they kind of compact things and try to keep you and hold you to field goals. If they can maintain that and keep that kind of success they had doing that last season, I think this is still going to be a good Arkansas team. But the problem is, like I said, with that schedule, this could be a very good Arkansas team, and they could still go 7-5.
Tom, always great to see you. CBS Sports college football writer Tom Fornelli, part of the Cover 3 podcast. Of course, you can check out that for more on the preseason rankings. All right, so we're now 10 teams into the top 25. Tuesday, we discussed Pittsburgh through Wake Forest, the 2 teams who fought for the ACC title, bookending that section. Tennessee, Kentucky, and Houston also in there. Chip referring to the Cougars' defense as a Sack Avenue. A name that will stick. And then the 5 we just discussed, led by the Spartans at 20, capped by Arkansas at 16. We'll hit 15 through 11 on Thursday and then begin the top 10 countdown by featuring one team every day, starting Friday with Baylor. Again, the full list, all 131 teams ranked by our college football experts over on CBSSports.com.
Instant analysis, no yelling, no fake debates, no politics. Hit the subscribe button and never miss a moment.